The year is etched somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance. A vast, difficult stretch of history we casually call the medieval age. When we close our eyes and think of this era, the images that spring forth are often bright and dramatic. The gleaming steel of a jousting knight, the rich tapestries of a grand hall, or the boisterous spectacle of a village fair. But these were the glittering margins of a world defined by its core, by the silent, unyielding majority, the peasantry. They were the bedrock of society, the anonymous heroes whose story is not one of conquest or glory, but of sheer, unbelievable endurance. And for them, winter was no mere change of season. It was an annual, brutal test of life itself. Imagine the transition. The harvest is done, a few precious sacks of grain are secured, and then the air turns sharp, the sun retreats, and the sky becomes a perpetual, low-hanging gray. The festive glow of autumn quickly gives way to a chilling, relentless reality. For the average peasant, the question wasn't how to be comfortable. It was, with terrifying simplicity, how do we not die tonight? Winter arrived like a cruel, unwavering teacher, one who offered no second chances and graded only on survival. Picture your home. It's a tiny, one-room hovel, a crude box built of earth, sticks, and straw. The walls are not the sturdy timber or stone of a nobleman's dwelling, but thin screens of wattle and daub, a mesh of interwoven branches smeared with mud, and, yes, a crucial admixture of animal dung. This wasn't a choice for gross-out effect. The dung was a cheap, sticky, and readily available insulator. The entire structure is a fragile boundary between life and death. You have no proper windows, only a small hole or two, often stuffed with a thin sheet of greased animal hide or a wooden shutter, less a source of light, and more a perpetual source of draft. The air inside your tiny, single-chambered world never quite escapes the cold. If the temperature outside is freezing, inside it's merely politely less freezing. A couple of degrees of relief, a cruel congratulation for not being outside, is all you get. Nights, especially, are an epic of dread. Darkness descends, swallowing the world whole, and the wind outside begins its relentless, mournful howl, an angry ghost testing every crack and gap in your flimsy defenses. The fire in the central hearth, the only true comfort, sputters and struggles, a brave but ultimately weak beacon. It manages to roast the toes of whoever is directly beside it, creating a tiny, intense sphere of warmth. But move just a few feet away, and the cold reclaims you, rendering the rest of the room essentially the same temperature as the bitter outdoors. You are, in effect, camping, but with worse snacks and nowhere to truly escape the wind's chilling reach. Your clothing is little help. Forget the imagined luxury of furs or thick, soft goose-down blankets. A peasant's wardrobe consists of a few rough-spun wool tunics, layered one on top of the other, and perhaps a heavy cloak that carries the distinct, earthy odor of the goat whose fleece it once was. You pile these layers on, transforming yourself into a stiff, lumpy human onion, hoping that the trapped air and the scratchy wool will somehow hold the heat. It is a gesture of hope more than a guarantee of comfort. And your bed? It is not a soft, inviting haven. It's typically a wooden frame, or often just a designated patch of floor covered with a rough sack stuffed with hay or straw. This crunchy, shifting surface provides a small, scratchy layer of insulation against the earth. But this insulation is temporary, constantly flattening, breeding fleas, and doing little to combat the brutal cold radiating up from the frozen ground. Every morning that you manage to stir, shake off the deep chill, and find yourself still breathing, with all your toes still attached, is a minor miracle, a small, quiet victory in a war that never truly ends. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the simple, deadly act of freezing to death are not distant possibilities. They're constant, lurking threats, especially to the very young and the very old. Surviving a medieval winter is not about thriving. It is about grit, ingenuity, and a daily, stubborn refusal to succumb. If the modern concept of a drafty room conjures images of a slightly ill-fitting window or a gap under a door, the medieval peasant's experience was one of living inside an enthusiastic wind tunnel that just happened to possess a roof. The structural core of their home, the wattle and daub construction, was cheap, effective to erect quickly, but inherently vulnerable to the elements. The wattle was the interwoven lattice of hazel, willow, or split wood, the skeleton. The daub was the body, a thick, often lovingly, if crudely, applied mixture of wet soil, clay, straw, lime, and crucially, animal manure. This manure, most often cow or horse dung, wasn't just a readily available component. It was a primitive engineering solution. The fibers in the straw and the sticky binding agents in the dung helped hold the daub together, preventing it from cracking and crumbling as it dried. It was a remarkable piece of low-cost, high-performance, and entirely natural insulation. Yet, even with this ingenious, though fragrant, plasterwork, these walls were no match for the sustained assault of a winter storm. As the fierce winds and driving rain battered the hut, the mixture would inevitably begin to degrade, allowing the cold to find every microscopic weakness. The wind didn't just rattle the door. It gleefully danced through the house, spiraling around the single room, ensuring that no one could ever settle into a true, lasting comfort. Above their heads, the thatched roof presented its own set of seasonal problems. While visually quaint and picturesque to our modern eyes, a roof woven from reeds, straw, or heather was only as good as its maintenance. Over months of steady rain, sleet, and snow, the thatch absorbed water, becoming heavy and sagging. This led to leaks, which introduced dampness, a greater conductor of cold, and offered easy entry points for unwelcome house guests. Nothing shattered the illusion of a quiet, cozy evening quite like the sound of a startled mouse or a chunk of frozen, soggy turf dropping onto a cooking pot. Windows, as a concept, barely existed. A window was a hole, pure and simple. Glass was an exorbitant luxury, typically only afforded for a single, small pane, even by the local lord. For the peasant, the opening was covered either by thick wooden shutters, which had to be kept closed during the worst weather, or by thin, translucent animal hides that had been greased or oiled to offer some feeble resistance to the wind and rain. They lent almost no light, but they were better than a hole. When the wind ripped at the house during a blizzard, the family's greatest fear was not just the cold, but the sight of a precious cowhide window cover being torn right off the wall. The final component of this icy assault came from below. The floor was nothing more than compacted dirt, occasionally covered with a scattering of rushes or straw. When the winter rains or melting snow saturated the ground outside, the mud would seep up through the earth floor. This created a perpetually damp environment, what could be generously termed an indoor water feature. Every step within the home felt like a grim trudge across a frozen marsh. It was a three-dimensional assault on body heat. Cold from the sagging roof, cold from the porous walls, and cold, relentless from the earth underfoot. But medieval peasants were not a people prone to whining. Their survival was rooted in an almost religious stubbornness and unfailing ingenuity. They didn't have a construction crew. They had themselves. They packed the worst gaps with handfuls of moss, jammed old rags into the largest holes, and perhaps even smeared fresh animal grease into the walls to create a temporary, water-resistant seal. They understood that the collective, strategic defense of their home, however crude, was the only thing standing between them and becoming a medieval popsicle. The battle against the cold was an ongoing, active engagement, not a passive retreat. The most insidious, relentless enemy a medieval peasant faced was not the wind or the snow, but a silent, permeating force rising from the very foundation of their world, the frozen ground itself. Their homes did not rest on concrete or insulated floorboards. They rested directly on the earth. The floor was just a slightly flatter, marginally cleaner patch of the same cold dirt that lay outside. For months, as the winter took hold, this earth became a reservoir of cold, a chilling layer of permafrost that refused to relinquish its grasp. The cold didn't just make the air chilly. It seeped up from the ground like an evil, invisible worm, working its way through the thin layers of straw, past the bedding, and straight into the bones of anyone trying to rest. Drop a piece of bread onto the floor during a midwinter night, and by morning, it felt as though it had become a permanent frozen artifact of the cold. Medieval peasants were forced to fight this grim, subterranean battle with whatever poor resources they had. The most common defense was layering. They would spread thick mats of fresh straw across the floor. If you were a fortunate or successful peasant, you could afford to use your own straw. More often, it involved the delicate balancing act of borrowing or subtly stealing enough from a nearby field without attracting the notice of the bailiff or a neighbor. This straw layer, while welcome, was temporary. It flattened quickly underfoot, grew damp and moldy even faster, and added a crunchy, rustling soundtrack to every movement in the night. A common alternative, or supplement, was the use of rushes, long, tough grasses harvested from marshy areas. These were spread thick upon the dirt, and sometimes, for the sake of masking the overwhelming odor of livestock and stale sweat, were mixed with handfuls of sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or rosemary. This mixture offered the illusion of comfort and freshness for perhaps a day. But a peculiar and often revolting custom evolved. Instead of cleaning out the old, soiled rushes, new ones were simply thrown on top. Over weeks and months, this created a multi-layered, decomposing ecosystem, a biological, medieval carpet padding teeming with organic matter, food scraps, mold, and a delightful population of fleas and lice. This unhygienic layer, though foul-smelling, was undeniably a form of insulation, creating a barrier between the sleeper and the icy earth. It was a perfect, if disgusting, illustration of how function brutally superseded form in the peasant's survival calculus. The beds themselves offered little escape from this cold reality. They were typically nothing more than basic wooden frames filled with yet more straw or hay. They were lumpy, shifting, and prone to poking their occupants, offering minimal cushioning and even less defense against the cold that radiated up from the floor. A person tossing and turning in the middle of the night wasn't merely seeking comfort. They were engaged in a desperate, awkward dance to keep their blood flowing and avoid letting one side of their body succumb to the chilling stillness. In the end, medieval peasants did not conquer the icy ground. They simply learned to live uncomfortably but resiliently just above it. A good night's sleep was not measured by the quality of one's dreams or the softness of the mattress. It was a measure of success determined purely by waking up intact. It was a testament to human fortitude that, while modern people rely on complex HVAC systems and memory foam, the medieval soul persevered with a simple, layered pile of dead plant matter. If the peasant home was a fragile shell against the winter, the single object that gave it life, warmth, and purpose was the hearth. It was not a grand, stone-mantled fireplace designed for aesthetics. It was a basic, essential fire pit, a pile of stones, or a simple depression in the dirt floor, located centrally within the one-room dwelling. This crude pit was the beating heart of hope, the only true defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval existence. In the vast majority of peasant homes, there was no chimney. This is the key difference that transforms the atmosphere of the home. Smoke, instead of being neatly channeled skyward, was forced to do its clumsy best. It drifted lazily, seeking any available exit. Small, smoke-stained holes intentionally left in the roof, cracks in the walls, or, most commonly, right into the lungs of the inhabitants. Life in a peasant cottage was, quite literally, an act of being slow-smoked. It wasn't just uncomfortable. The constant inhalation of thick, wood smoke was a serious health hazard that undeniably shortened lifespans. However, this perpetual atmospheric haze had an unexpected, grisly benefit. It acted as an impromptu fumigator. The smoke did a remarkably effective job of driving away or outright killing the clouds of fleas, lice, and other unwanted pests that perpetually plagued the bedding and clothing. When you're marinated in smoke 24/7, you possess a built-in pest control system. The hearth's role extended far beyond mere warmth. It was the kitchen, with pots suspended over the flames for the simple, often watery pottage that formed the staple of the peasant diet. It was the only source of light after sunset, transforming the dark, drafty room into a small, flickering stage. And, in the absence of books or other forms of entertainment, the hearth became the social epicenter, the medieval version of the family television. As the family gathered in the small, warm sphere around the fire, the only spot in the house truly free from the biting cold, the night came alive with human connection. Here, stories were spun, often the same ancient tales told countless times, but infused with fresh life by the intensity of the cold night. Gossip was exchanged, family plans were debated, and perhaps most importantly, cultural memory was passed down. The flickering light transformed the faces of the elders into animated masks as they recounted local history, folk remedies, or the proper way to bank a fire. The act of staring into the flames was not laziness. It was a deeply ingrained, contemplative ritual born of necessity. Keeping this precious fire alive was an unwavering commandment. If the fire died out completely, it was a profound failure, an open invitation for the cold to finish the job. Rekindling a fire in the dead of winter was an arduous process, a frustrating, numb-fingered battle fought with flint and steel, the patient encouragement of a single, precious spark, and a desperate prayer over whatever dry kindling could be spared. This necessity meant that the entire family was conscripted into the battle. Children collected sticks, parents supervised the fuel, and the most trusted member watched the embers. The hearth wasn't a guarantee of survival, but without this smoky, often sputtering little flame, survival was an absolute impossibility. In the darkest, coldest months, the hearth was the tangible, beating heart of human hope itself. In the rigid, unforgiving world of the medieval winter, running out of fuel was a crisis, but letting the hearth fire die overnight was a catastrophe. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the house would chill to a deadly degree within hours, and the act of restarting it was a dangerous, time-consuming gamble. The age of matches and lighters was centuries away. Rekindling the fire meant striking flint and steel together, a cold, repetitive chore demanding patience and a prayer for the one crucial spark. To attempt this in the deep freeze, half asleep with frozen, clumsy fingers, was a task born of desperation. This is where the venerable, vital art of banking the fire came in. It was a piece of inherited wisdom, a nightly act of domestic engineering that was as crucial to survival as the harvest itself. Banking was not about a cozy savings account. It was about the meticulous insulation of the embers. Just before the family turned in for the night, the remaining coals were not allowed to simply burn out. They were instead carefully gathered and then buried under a dense mound of clean, dry wood ash. The ash, being a magnificent insulator, acted as a protective blanket. It starved the embers of most of their oxygen, but locked in their residual heat, keeping them alive, just barely, in a state of low, glowing suspension until the break of day. If performed correctly, the process was a triumph of foresight. The first person up at sunrise could simply stroll over, poke the pile with a stick, reveal the precious, still glowing coals, add fresh kindling, and voila! Fire was reborn without the brutal fight of flint and steel. The family had bought themselves hours of precious warmth and safety. But if the banking was done incorrectly, the consequences were severe. Too much dampness, too tight a packing, or a sudden, fierce draft could snuff out the tiny, preserved glow. That morning would arrive colder, darker, and infinitely grumpier, heralded by the miserable sound of someone desperately scraping flint against steel, fighting the bone-deep chill that had successfully breached the house's defenses. Banking the fire was a skill passed down through generations, often imbued with a near-superstitious reverence and a fierce pride. Everyone had their personal secrets and deeply held beliefs. Some families insisted on only using bone-dry ash. Others swore by a slight dampening to create a perfect, sealed crust. The packing method itself was a subject of intense debate. Tight and compact, or loose enough to allow the slightest breath of air. You could, in effect, start a medieval argument just by critiquing someone's banking technique. The ancient equivalent of arguing over the perfect barbecue temperature, only with the stakes of survival hanging in the balance. The need for vigilance was constant. Sometimes, even a perfectly banked fire could be extinguished by an unexpected draft or an accident, a tripping child, or a clumsy animal stumbling into the hearth. This necessity gave rise to the night watch, the rudimentary system of shift work that meant someone would periodically be jolted awake in the freezing dark to quietly check the glowing mound. This was the medieval thermostat check, a cold, begrudging duty that cemented the fact that warmth was never a given. It was something that had to be earned and defended every single hour of the long, dark winter night. Even a single surviving ember at dawn was a victory, and enough to empower the family to face the coming day. In the cold logic of medieval survival, the phrase "the more the merrier" transcended social conviviality. It became a strategic imperative. When the flimsy wattle walls leaked cold air and the small hearth offered only localized warmth, the most powerful, reliable source of heat available was the one that walked and breathed each other. The concept of personal space simply dissolved under the threat of frostbite. On the coldest nights, the objective was not comfort or privacy, but the raw, non-negotiable goal of survival. This led to the formation of the human lasagna, entire households piling together into the warmest, most protected corner of the single-room house. Wrapped in every available scrap of rough wool, threadbare cloak, and hide, the family formed a dense, multi-layered mass of shared body heat. The arrangement was often strategic. Babies and frail elders, the most vulnerable to the cold, were tucked deep into the center of the mass, treated like precious, fragile heat generators. The strongest, warmest adults would take the outer layers, forming a living shield against the freezing drafts that snaked along the walls and floor. To be on the edge was to draw the short straw. It was the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the open door of a meat locker. But even this disadvantage was mitigated by the constant warmth radiating from the bodies pressed against your back and legs. This desperate clustering came with a rigid set of rules enforced by the chilling air. Movement was a communal risk. A single shift to get comfortable could result in the person next to you being suddenly exposed to the draft by the wall. Woe betide the clumsy sleeper who accidentally jostled a sibling or an uncle, earning a sharp, silent kick and the title of family villain for disrupting the fragile bubble of warmth. In a truly cold house, the slightest exposure felt like a slap of icy doom. This practice extended beyond immediate family. Communal bedding was often shared. A single, massive straw mattress or a heap of rushes serving the sleeping needs of multiple generations. When Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, there was always room because there had to be. The resulting atmosphere was undeniably chaotic. A symphony of deep breathing, nervous rustling, and inevitable snoring, all under a shared, scratchy blanket that, given the era's lack of hygiene, carried the powerful, complex scent of several weeks of hard labor and smoke. Yet, this intense, forced intimacy was not without its human grace notes. The long, dark winter nights spent huddled together fostered an extraordinary level of family bonding. Muffled under the scratchy wool, the children heard the most intimate stories and the most fundamental lessons. The closeness led to secrets shared, whispered jokes, and the quiet, comforting knowledge that you were not alone in facing the terrible cold. It was a physical and emotional necessity, transforming survival into a deep, shared experience. The next time a sibling steals a blanket, the memory of this crowded, desperate, yet fundamentally human huddle stands as a stark reminder. You are not fighting for a corner of the bed. You are fighting for life itself. For the medieval peasant, the winter house was never a sanctuary reserved solely for humans. It was a chaotic, one-room, mixed-species encampment where the household's livestock became vital, four-legged furnaces. If modern sensibilities recoil at sharing a bedroom with a pig or a goat, the peasants saw it as a simple, unavoidable piece of survival arithmetic. Bringing animals indoors, cows, goats, pigs, and chickens, was more than a quirky village tradition. It was a calculated strategy for thermal gain. Every beast possessed a beating heart and a significant body temperature. And in a poorly insulated hut where the wind howled louder than a hungry stomach, every single degree of warmth generated by those bodies mattered immensely. A cow exhaled an impressive amount of warm air and generated a large, radiant heat source. Strategically, this placement also served a crucial security function. If your most valuable asset, the goat or cow, was pressed against the wall of your sleeping space, it was significantly less likely to be stolen by a desperate neighbor in the dead of night. Two birds, one stinky, warm stone. At night, the single room transformed into a chaotic living furnace. Cows, the largest and warmest contributors, often took center stage near the family's sleeping area, lounging luxuriously against the walls, chewing their cud with an air of paying rent. Goats, with their dense, heat-trapping hair, were allowed closer into the main human space, not just for their warmth, but because, being goats, they would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roost in the rafters or within old, woven baskets, while the pigs, indifferent to all social niceties, simply plopped down wherever they pleased, often near the hearth or smack in the middle of the foot traffic. The environment that resulted from this shared living arrangement was, by any modern measure, legendary. The smells were complex, overpowering, and fierce. A thick, layered perfume of wood smoke, stale human sweat, damp straw, and the unyielding effluvium of multiple species of farm animals. By springtime, the total perfume of a shared winter was something that likely carried down the road. But the peasants, developing a selective, necessary nose blindness, did not complain much. They understood the cold, undeniable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen fingers and toes in the morning. Of course, this intimacy was not without its hazards and surprising moments. Imagine drifting off to sleep only to be jolted awake by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good, slightly damp perch, or worse, the shock of stepping barefoot onto a fresh, warm surprise first thing in the morning. Medieval mornings were full of such rude awakenings. Still, the simple, powerful math held true. Cold kills, and a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath on a sub-zero night was often the crucial deciding factor between enduring until the thaw and succumbing to the ice. It was a life of hardship, certainly, but a life sustained by the pragmatic, resilient partnership between human and beast. In the harrowing theater of medieval winter, fashion was thermal warfare, and the only victory that mattered was non-death. Peasants weren't concerned with trends. They were layering up like soldiers preparing for a protracted, defensive campaign against the grim Reaper himself. The simple, non-negotiable rule was, if you owned it, you wore it. And often, you wore it all at once. The layering process was a ritual of necessity. It began with a basic undertunic, usually a coarse, scratchy linen shirt that had likely not seen a proper washing in weeks or months. Over this went a thicker, more insulating woolen tunic. If the peasant was fortunate, a second, sometimes third woolen layer would follow, creating the necessary air pockets that trapped body heat. They added crudely made leggings that constantly sagged, a heavy, rough-spun cloak draped over the shoulders, and as the grand final defense, a precious, patched-up piece of sheepskin thrown on top, a prized trophy of warmth. The result was a person who was approximately 10% warmer, 90% itchier, and looked remarkably like a lumpy laundry bag waddling awkwardly across a cold room. Footwear was a critical, yet often inadequate, defense. Boots were a true luxury, expensive and difficult to maintain. The majority of peasants relied on simple, wooden-soled clogs, sabots, or rough leather shoes. To combat the cold that gnawed at their extremities, they would wrap their feet in layers of cloth or old rags, stuffing them into the clogs to create a makeshift insulation layer. If the cold still bit through, The only option was to add another rag and pray that all 10 toes made it to springtime. The entire wardrobe was a reflection of the peasants' precarious economic reality. Clothing was a scarce, valuable asset, a difficult investment of time and resources. This scarcity drove another behavior, the deliberate choice not to wash. Laundering clothing in the depths of winter was a logistical nightmare. It meant dragging heavy, wet fabric to a partially frozen stream, breaking the ice, and then facing the 2-day gamble of waiting for the item, which might be your only outer layer, to dry without freezing solid into a tragic, unwearable ice sculpture. Most peasants pragmatically decided that smelling like a complex mix of smoke, sweat, and goat was a small, necessary price to pay for not succumbing to the cold. Ironically, the lack of hygiene provided a tactical advantage. The accumulated layers of dirt, grime, and natural body oils created an external crust. This unglamorous coating effectively clogged the tiny gaps in the rough woolen weave, making the garment more wind-resistant and better at trapping heat. It was in essence a naturally occurring medieval Gore-Tex jacket, smellier and far less socially acceptable, but supremely functional. Items like woolen caps, scarves, and mittens were treasured possessions. A simple cap could mean the difference between a restless night and a deadly morning. Style, elegance, and comfort were alien concepts. In the medieval winter, warmth was the only flex that counted. In the medieval peasant's survival playbook, dirt was elevated beyond mere soil. It was a tactical component of their defense system. The prevailing modern assumption is that the medieval aversion to bathing and laundry was due to sheer ignorance or laziness. The historical reality, however, is far more nuanced. In winter, being grimy was strategic, protective, and smart. The fundamental problem facing the peasant was heat loss. Clean clothes, especially the thin linen worn as an undergarment, were often too breathable. In air temperatures hovering near freezing, breathable was a deadly term. It allowed precious, hard-won body heat to escape too quickly. The solution was to create a natural, insulative barrier. As the weeks of unwashed labor passed, layers of grime, thick natural body oils, sweat, and soil began to saturate the fabric of the rough tunics, cloaks, and leggings. This accumulating crust served an essential function. It effectively weatherproofed the clothing. The particulate matter clogged the porous weave of the wool, significantly increasing the material's wind resistance. The peasant, covered in a greasy, smoky outer layer, was equipped with a custom-made thermal shield that locked in heat more effectively than any clean garment could. You might smell like a goat who lost a bet, but you were warm, and in that era, warmth was everything. Furthermore, there is a widespread, culturally accepted belief that frequent bathing in cold weather was actively dangerous and a route to sickness. The winter, especially, was a time when the body was viewed as needing to conserve all its heat and vital humors. Washing oneself was thought to open the pores, making the body vulnerable to the deadly, chilling, bad airs, miasma, that could lead to pneumonia or consumption, the great winter killers. Better, then, to keep that protective, holy layer of filth intact. Bathing was, therefore, a rare event, often reserved for high summer or religious occasions. Laundry was rarer still. Soap, when it existed, was a precious, alkaline commodity reserved for the highest status items. Peasants simply layered their clothing without changing the ones underneath. The outer tunic became a walking museum of the past month's labors. Every stain a heroic record of a day survived. To an outside observer, a visiting, cleaner nobleman, for instance, the peasant's condition would have appeared utterly filthy. But the peasant knew the truth. That thick, crusty, greasy outer layer was not a sign of failure, but a sign of successful thermal management. It was a testament to their pragmatic, tough-minded approach to survival. In a world where every single person stank to high heaven, nose blindness was a way of life, and the olfactory offense was negligible. Filth was not a moral failing. It was function and armor against the deadly cold. By February, a peasant with a thick, grimy sheen wasn't losing. They were winning the war against nature. If modern life is defined by the quest for the perfect night's rest, the medieval peasant slumber was defined by a different, harsher reality. Let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. The reality of their bedding was far removed from any notion of comfort. It was rustic, crunchy, and perpetually alive. For those who were relatively affluent within the peasantry, a rough wooden frame provided a slight elevation from the floor. This frame was then covered with a large sack, which was stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. This was the peasant's mattress, a lumpy, shifting, poking mess that carried the faint but persistent aroma of the barnyard and the constant undertone of damp earth. Every shift, every toss and turn in the night, generated a delightful, loud soundtrack of crinkling, dry straw, punctuated by the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk of hay that had wriggled free. Many peasants skipped the wooden frame altogether, simply layering a thick pile of straw directly onto the dirt floor. This created the most basic form of bedding, a groundal sleeping experience that, while deeply uncomfortable, provided a crucial insulating layer against the unyielding cold radiating up from the frozen earth. The use of rushes was particularly common. These long grasses were spread thick across the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender, sweet woodruff, or rosemary, a desperate attempt to mask the overwhelming odor of smoke, sweat, and animal life that dominated the house. For a day or two, the aroma was genuinely pleasant, but once crushed, dampened by breath and tracked in mud, and inevitably mixed with food scraps and whatever else wandered in, the rushes quickly turned into a muddy, decomposing slurry. The major, unrelenting problem with this organic bedding was its impermanence and its inhabitants. Over time, the straw flattened into a near-solid mat, became damp, grew moldy, and rapidly transformed into a perfect haven for parasites. The phrase, sleeping with your enemies, was a literal truth. Fleas, lice, and various other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. Changing the straw was an infrequent, dreaded chore. A full household event usually performed only a few times a year, or whenever the infestation became so severe that the bed seemed to be actively moving without human assistance. Despite the profound hardships, the scratching, the lumps, the cold, the smell, these humble, crunchy beds were undeniable lifelines. Piling straw high created a thermal break from the earth. More importantly, clumping together on top of it, creating pockets of intense, shared body heat, was the medieval method of centralized, communal heating. When modern people sink into their soft, supportive, sterile mattresses, they should spare a thought for their medieval ancestors, who grinned through the discomfort, knowing that their pile of scratchy plants and sheer body odor was a success story against the elements. Living in a structure built of sticks, mud, and sheer human optimism quickly taught the medieval peasant that the cold was not a natural phenomenon. It was a tireless, insidious enemy conducting personal attacks on their home. The wattle walls warped, the mud daub crumbled, and the thatch sagged, leaving countless cracks and gaps for the wind to exploit. Sealing the house was a perpetual, exhausting maintenance task that elevated the art of draft-proofing into an absolute survival necessity. The peasant arsenal for this battle was crude but effective, whatever they could cram into a hole. Gaps in the wattle were stuffed with handfuls of moss, bundles of dry grass, or whatever scraps of old, unusable cloth could be found. Some even used animal hair mixed with clay for an extra measure of insulation. The entire household had to be vigilant, constantly scanning the walls and roof for the telltale sign of a cold draft, a flicker in the hearth flame, or the sound of the wind whistling through a forgotten gap. The mud and dung daub, once applied, needed continuous reinforcement. As an annual winter project, the peasant family might be forced to stand outside in the freezing weather, slapping cold manure and mud onto the exterior walls, patching and reinforcing the defenses. The sheer absurdity of this image, a person muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury," while applying cow dung to their house, belied the desperate necessity of the act. It was, in its own way, a profound act of defiance. The thatched roof was another constant battlefield. Thatch was inherently leak-prone, especially after heavy rain or snow. To plug these holes, peasants employed whatever material was at hand: spare bundles of reeds, rags, or, in moments of desperation and great risk, chunks of turf sliced from the nearest field. The turf was heavy, provided immediate bulk, and was a quick fix, but its theft was often a punishable offense, illustrating the high stakes of winter survival. By the end of the season, every peasant home looked like a slightly battered, intensely sad patchwork quilt, each patch a story of a draft defeated. The window openings and doors, even when they existed, were often little more than wood planks hung with iron nails and sheer determination. To block the worst of the chilling drafts, the window holes were often covered with thick pieces of animal hide or heavy cloth that had been soaked in animal fat. This served a dual purpose. It created a more effective barrier against the wind and gave the home a perpetually low-level, mystery meat aroma. Every night was a personal struggle between the peasants' unwavering ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. A momentary lapse in vigilance, a patch that came loose, or a sudden, sharp gust could find the one spot that was missed, slapping the sleeping household awake like the frosty hand of doom. Yet, through this non-stop process of patching, stuffing, and muddled ingenuity, the medieval peasants successfully fought off the worst of the cold, one desperate, muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to turn sleep into a series of shivery awakenings, the medieval peasant household adopted a survival tactic that transcended comfort and became a structured necessity: sleeping in shifts. This was not a grand, organized military system, but a grim, pragmatic agreement that the fire, and thus the family, could not be left unattended. The central problem was the hearth's vulnerability. Left alone, even a banked fire would eventually die down, and restarting it, as has been noted, was a task only undertaken with dread. Therefore, the heat had to be managed, stoked, and maintained. This demanded a constant ember patrol. Half the household would attempt to find a few precious hours of half-frozen rest, while the other half remained awake, or in a state of light, chilly, dozing, tending to the hearth, and keeping an ear out for the telltale sounds of a draft or an animal stirring. The rotation of this duty was a heavy burden. The person responsible for the current shift would have to periodically stumble out of the communal huddle, shattering their hard-won warmth, and go to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, all while trying to navigate the dark room without stepping on a sleeping sibling or a restless goat. There are no 5 more minutes snooze buttons, no night vision, just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing, deep resentment toward whoever in the sleeping mass snored loudest. Even children old enough to hold a stick were quickly pressed into this service. They learned, early and intimately, the uncompromising reality of winter survival. Everyone pulled their weight, or the entire family suffered. Grandparents, often too frail to sleep comfortably on the cold floor, sometimes volunteered to maintain the longest vigil by the fire. Their experience in banking the coals was invaluable, and frankly, the pain of lying down and getting up again with arthritis made the small comfort of sitting by the hearth a relative blessing. The sleep obtained during the off shift was never quality rest. It was a fitful, shallow dozing, punctuated by the sounds of the night. A family member moving about, the rustling of animals, the constant sigh and battering of the wind against the fragile walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who had rolled over too vigorously. The exhaustion was a constant companion throughout the winter. Yet, despite the bone-deep fatigue, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts ensured there was always a set of cold, begrudging, but dedicated hands ready to manage the hearth. The fire survived, the embers glowed on, and by extension, so did the family. The watchman's duty was the quiet, unsung labor that truly saved the peasant's life, a testament to their absolute pragmatism. The next time anyone complains about adjusting the thermostat, they should spare a long thought for the medieval peasant, squinting into a smoky, dying fire at 3 a.m., wrestling with a stick and the desperate, simple will to survive. In the quiet, internal battle against the medieval winter, survival extended even to the most fundamental human action, breathing. The peasant didn't just fight the freezing air with wool and fire. They employed a subtle, life-saving technique of survival breathing to protect their most vulnerable organ, the lungs. The danger was simple and mortal. Deep, open-mouthed breaths in sub-zero air would pull the icy chill straight into the core of the body. In a world with no antibiotics and no proper medical care, a cold that settled deep in the chest was often a one-way ticket to a quick, deadly case of pneumonia or consumption. The peasant knew this fear intimately. The long, rattling cough of a neighbor was a terrifying predictor of an imminent funeral. The simple, learned solution was to keep breathing shallow, slow, and exclusively through the nose. The nasal passages, with their intricate system of hairs and mucous membranes, acted as a rudimentary, natural heat exchanger. They gently pre-warmed the intensely cold air just enough before it hit the delicate lung tissue. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a crucial, low-tech way to mitigate the risk of chilling the body from the inside out. Children were taught this trick early and harshly. A little one caught panting like a dog or sucking in a great gulp of cold air would be sharply scolded, their parents instilling the fear of the lung sickness that could follow. An accidental mouthful of icy air bought the patient a week of coughing up phlegm, which would be treated by a grim grandmother with ineffective folk remedies, firm prayers, and endless cups of hot onion or turnip tea. In a more tangible defense, many peasants, especially when sleeping, would tuck parts of their cloak, a shawl, or a rag up over their nose and mouth. This created a makeshift breath warmer, a small, enclosed space where the expelled, warm breath could heat the incoming air. The downside was obvious. By morning, the fabric was damp, clammy, and slightly soggy from condensation. But the small, localized bubble of warmth it provided around the breathing passages was a powerful psychological and physical reassurance against the deep, mortal cold. This necessity highlights the depth of the peasant struggle. Survival wasn't just about food and fire. It was about the continuous, microscopic vigilance over the body's processes. The winter demanded that a person think about how they breathe just to stay alive. The ability to endure was not always a grand gesture. Sometimes, it was simply the quiet, life-saving act of breathing slowly through the nose while huddled under a greasy, smoky blanket. It was a testament to the fact that in the medieval winter, no detail, however small, could be left to chance. The peasants' battle against the cold was not limited to walls and bedding. It was inextricably linked to the fundamental economy of heat, food, and fuel. Winter radically reshaped the peasants' diet, creating a tight, brutal link between what they ate and their ability to produce and maintain body heat. The diet shifted from the relative plenty of harvest time to a monotonous, calorie-deficient regimen based on storage and preservation. Fresh vegetables, herbs, and fruits vanished. The peasant relied heavily on pottage, a thick, watery stew made from whatever was stored. Dried beans, peas, cabbage, and the precious, storable grain, mostly rye or barley. The small amount of meat consumed was usually salted, smoked, or dried, an indulgence only when an animal had to be slaughtered before the winter truly began. This diet was calorically dense enough to survive, but rarely rich enough to truly fuel a sustained defense against the cold. The lack of fresh vitamins and minerals inevitably led to the seasonal illnesses and debility that made a peasant more susceptible to the deadly cold. Crucially, every single calorie consumed had to be burned simply to maintain core body temperature. A peasant perpetually felt a gnawing hunger, a constant, low-level deficit that the cold exacerbated. They became acutely aware that food was fuel, a necessity not just for labor, but for internal survival. The body's ability to shiver, an energy-intensive process, was dependent on the calories they had managed to consume. Equally vital was the struggle for firewood and fuel. Wood was the premium commodity, but it was scarce, heavy, and often owned by the local lord, making it expensive or outright illegal to harvest from the communal forests. The peasant relied on cruder, less efficient fuel sources, bundles of kindling, dried sticks, gathered brush, and most importantly, peat. Peat, which is partially decomposed organic matter cut from bogs, burned longer and slower than wood, making it an invaluable, if smoky, resource for the continuous low heat needed for banking the fire. The sheer difficulty of acquiring and storing fuel led to a dangerous side effect: fuel theft. Desperate peasants might risk a night raid on the Lord's woods or a neighbor's stored pile just to ensure their family would not freeze. This act, often punishable by severe fines or even bodily harm, underscores the absolute zero-sum game of the medieval winter. A fire that died out was a tragedy. A fire that was maintained meant the triumph of ingenuity and sometimes the triumph of necessity over morality. The constant, gnawing worry over the shrinking pile of wood and the dwindling sack of grain defined the emotional landscape of the long winter months. A constant reminder that the war against the cold was an economic as well as a physical one. As the long, white grip of winter tightened its hold, the medieval world underwent a profound, seasonal social transformation. The fear of death was omnipresent, yet it was balanced by the fierce, necessary strength of community and shared hope. The physical world shrank dramatically. The snow and ice made the rudimentary roads nearly impassable, leading to a period of intense isolation. Travel, trade, and even visits between neighboring villages ground to a near halt. The peasant's life retreated into the immediate, small sphere of the one-room hut and its inhabitants. The family, already pressed together for thermal survival, became the entire social universe. This isolation could lead to cabin fever and increased tension, but it more often forced a deepened, inescapable reliance on immediate kin. Within the village itself, the cold demanded a new level of communal support. Resources, though scarce, were often shared out of mutual necessity. A struggling family might receive a few handfuls of grain or a bundle of precious kindling from a neighbor, knowing that next year, the roles might be reversed. While theft existed, so too did a sense of mutual preservation. The shared experience of misery and the high stakes of survival often welded the community together. Gatherings, when they did occur, were intense, vital affairs, perhaps a collective work task, or a quiet, necessary social function like an impromptu barn dance in the slightly warmer confines of a wealthy peasant's or a manor's large storage space, where the movement of dancing bodies generated communal heat. The spiritual life of the peasant was also intensely heightened during this period. Winter was a time of increased religious observance. The short days and long, menacing nights made the world feel perpetually close to the end, and the fear of natural death was immense. Peasants turned to prayer with desperation, clinging to the promise of spring and the spiritual comfort of the church. Saints associated with light, warmth, and protection, such as Saint Lucy, whose feast day falls in the dark of December, were invoked with special fervor. The prayers were not abstract pleas. They were practical, heartfelt cries for the thaw, for the coming of warmth, and for the grace of the new growing season. The winter's isolation and fear were not permanent. Every community carried within it the collective, quiet hope for the thaw. As the days began, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen after the solstice, a subtle psychological shift occurred. The constant vigilance remained, but it was now fueled by the anticipation of the first signs of green. The successful completion of a medieval winter was not just a physical feat. It was a profound psychological triumph, a defiant assertion of human will over the overwhelming power of nature. They survived not by conquering the cold, but by outwaiting it, one smoky, hungry, and crowded night at a time. The moment the sun finally broke through, warming the mud walls and signaling the retreat of the deep frost, was not merely a change in the weather. It was a joyous, collective resurrection.